World War II was incredibly complex, and it's difficult to pinpoint what every soldier from every nation thought of their enemies. However, through the study of historical records, some common perspectives have emerged. You probably know, especially if you're from an English-speaking country, how the Western Allies felt about the Japanese. But what about the Japanese soldiers' opinions on the Allied soldiers? And more specifically, what did they think about Americans, given that the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the U.S. into the war? By examining war documents, propaganda, and anecdotes, we aim to shed light on these questions today. In Japan's Meiji era, from 1868 to 1912, the country transitioned from an isolated feudal society to an industrialized nation-state, adopting Western innovations and culture. While the Japanese embraced baseball and Hollywood films, they also sought to maintain their cultural identity. To protect against Western colonization and to achieve great power status, the Meiji government emphasized national unity and patriotism. However, Japan's lack of natural resources like iron and oil meant that growth was synonymous with overseas expansion, which led to war. From the mid-1890s to 1945, Japan was almost continually engaged in military conflict. During the Showa era of the 1930s, Japanese nationalism reached new heights. In pursuit of great power status, Japan initiated another war against China, known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. This aggression angered the West, particularly America, which responded with embargoes on Japan, significantly hindering its ability to wage war. By mid-1941, about 80% of Japan's oil and much of its steel came from the U.S. The American embargo on oil exports to Japan was seen by some Japanese leaders as a preemptive declaration of war, leading to increased tensions. This sentiment is reflected in the Japanese military booklet, Read This Alone, and the War Can Be Won, issued in December 1941. The booklet states, "At stake in the present war, without a doubt, is the future prosperity or decline of the empire. Slowly, little by little, like a man strangling his victim with a soft cord of silken floss, America has been prohibiting the export to Japan of oil and steel." This perspective fueled the Japanese decision to bomb Pearl Harbor in December 1941, aiming to cripple the U.S. fleet and secure resources from the Far East. The Japanese military booklet also sheds light on how the Japanese perceived their role in the Far East. It states, "The English, the French, the Americans, the Dutch, the Portuguese, and others sailed into the Far East as if it were theirs by natural right, terrorized and subjugated the culturally backward natives, and colonized every country in the area. The natural resources of those countries were taken by a handful of white men, and tens of millions of Asian inhabitants have suffered constant exploitation and persecution at their hands. The other peoples of the Far East trust and honor the Japanese and hope that, with the help of the Japanese people, they may themselves achieve national independence and happiness." This narrative painted Japan as Asia's savior and the West as the aggressor. Japanese World War II propaganda reinforced these notions. John Dower, in his book War Without Mercy, Race and Power in the Pacific War, analyzes a graphic by Ikeda Eiji in the January 1942 issue of the Japanese periodical manga. Dower concludes that the Japanese saw themselves as the rising sun purifying the world, a reference to the Japanese Empire's flag. He writes, "The Japanese routinely referred to themselves as the leading race, Shido Minzoku, of the world. They called on a variety of metaphors, images, code phrases, and concepts to affirm their superiority, ranging from expressions that demeaned non-Japanese to elaborate affirmations of their own unique qualities." Conversely, writer Jack Wyckoff, in his review of Dower's book, notes that the Japanese depicted the enemy as demons, cannibalistic ogres, gangsters, Napoleonic megalomaniacs, and even dandruff. An example of such demonization is the portrayal of American President Roosevelt in Japanese propaganda. Unfortunately, Western allies sometimes lived up to these negative portrayals. U.S. forces, for instance, often refused to take Japanese soldiers as POWs. Dower's book also references the 1980 memoir of veteran William Manchester, who witnessed a young American soldier killing a line of unarmed, surrendered Japanese soldiers with a submachine gun on Okinawa in 1945. Historian Dennis Warner also recorded a U.S. Major General ordering a U.S. Colonel to execute a group of wounded, surrendering Japanese during the Bougainville Campaign from 1943 to 1945. These were just two among many accounts of such behavior. Another disturbing practice among American soldiers was the mutilation of dead Japanese soldiers for trophies. Historian Neil Ferguson notes that boiling the flesh off Japanese skulls was not an uncommon practice. In his book, With the Old Breed at Peleliu and Okinawa, Eugene Sledge describes an incident where a Marine extracted gold teeth from a live Japanese soldier, causing immense suffering before another Marine ended the soldier's life. Japanese soldiers were aware of Western atrocities, as shown by letters retrieved by U.S. Marines during the Guadalcanal Campaign from 1942 to 1943. According to Jerry Cutter and Jim Prozer's I'm Staying with My Boys, The Heroic Life of Sergeant John Basilone, USMC, one letter described the Americans as Marines recruited from jails and asylums, claiming they mutilated prisoners. To foster contempt for Western soldiers, Japanese propaganda emphasized perceived Western cowardice and lack of spiritual incentive. The Bushido Code, which regarded surrender as dishonorable, reinforced this view. U.S. Colonel Fred Borch noted that those who surrendered forfeited all honor and deserved nothing but contempt. The Japanese military booklet, Read This Alone and the War Can Be Won, described their opponents as cowardly and effeminate, disliking adverse conditions. John Toland's The Rising Sun and the Decline and Fall of the Japanese Empire, 1936 to 1945, quotes a pamphlet stating, Americans lacked spiritual incentive and sought only personal glory, fearing death and lacking motivation. As mentioned earlier, the war was nuanced, and it's difficult to determine how every soldier viewed their enemies. These perspectives are drawn from various Japanese military documents and propaganda. What do you think were the prevailing views among Japanese soldiers? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to History Intrigued for more captivating historical insights and stories.